So we are recording. We're here with Schmendrick. How are you doing, Schmendrick?
I am doing all right, Deep Left. How are you today?
I'm doing all right. I noticed you a while ago. You liked a couple of my articles, and so I started checking out what you're doing, which is very different from what I'm doing. But I actually do have one poem published on Substack, so I'm not entirely alien to the art, but that is your focus.
Mhm.
You do something interesting, which I haven't seen before, and maybe there are. You could open my mind up to other people who are doing this, and it's a simple thing. It's not too crazy, but what you're doing is you're writing out your poetry and you're taking pictures in physical writing because
Mhm.
I call myself a writer, but I actually don't engage in the physical act. I type on a keyboard. And when we're talking about poetry as a medium, I think it's for instance, we use a lot of uh, poetry is inherently metaphorical, allegorical,
Mhm.
symbolic, and it has its own. Poetry is an attempt to bridge the gap between words, which are abstract, disembodied, and to give them a body, to give them a form, to give them sensuous experience. Um,
Mhm.
so poetry is interacting with language not just through the literal meaning of the words, but the shape of the words, the sound of the words, the feeling of the words. So the fact that you have
Mhm.
taken that seriously and you've kind of gone back to an earlier form, which I mean, obviously the internet has biased us toward typing, but the Gutenberg printing press. But there was a time like the American Constitution. We actually have the Constitution, and it wasn't printed; it was written, and we can see the signatures of the founders. And that is one
Mhm.
of the like last holdovers of that original writing culture, which has now been formalized in like Japanese calligraphy. Um, or you could even say graphic design to an extent tries to
Yeah.
play with the form of words. And it's not something people. I'm going to link to your Substack, and people can go through it. It's not anything excessive or extravagant or you know again it's not calligraphy, but you do I just immediately on seeing it, I had an immediate reaction to saying like, yes, this is this is like a lost technology. Um and I think that this sense of we're losing um, these simple technologies, we're losing these ways in which to communicate, these subtle ways to communicate. That seems to be accelerating with the internet. Like, you can't tell who's sarcastic, who's ironic, who's trolling. You can't. There,
Mhm.
everything is text based, and now there's different layers of dissociation where, like, for example, a filter. When you take a picture on social media, you can filter the
Oh yeah.
image. You can change your race. You can change everything about yourself. You can create an avatar. You can project onto that. So in some
No one
ways,
knows you're a dog on the internet, right?
no one knows you're a dog. Um, and so, but the evidence, but I can see your writing here, so I know you have opposable
Mhm.
thumbs. I know you're not a dog. And like as we're going into AI, and there's this question of in terms of creative arts, like can AI write a poem? Can
Mhm.
AI write a song? Can AI paint a picture? And there's this anxiety about that. And I'm not saying AI couldn't reproduce images like you've produced with um
Of course.
yeah. So give me 1 second. I'm going to turn off an alarm, and then I'm going to ask you a question here. So I guess my question is, given that, did you see someone else doing this and you've picked up on that? Did you come up with this idea on your own? How did you come to
Mhm.
start publishing poetry like this?
Yeah, no, I haven't seen anybody else doing this at all. But I not only like put these out this way, it's not just like a representation. I draft and write my poems entirely by hand. So, and And there's a couple poems I like typed up in notes on my phone or something, a first draft of, just because it was the most convenient thing. But almost everything was written entirely by hand. The typed version I put at the bottom of my posts is generally the very first time that the poem has ever been typed out. Um, so I've been writing poetry for over 20 years now, and and I've always kind of written by hand. I've just typing just goes too quickly, and I like the physical act of it. There's something very satisfying about like forming those letters on the page and making a clean copy with no mistakes or with only one or two minor errors that you scratch out or what have you. Um, and I view that as kind of a an important part of the poem itself and the way that you're kind of talking about that gives another aspect to it that isn't there in just choosing choosing a particularly attractive font and and formatting the page and doing all that stuff. So yeah, it just seemed like the natural thing to do. And some friends had been telling me to I should publish my poetry for quite a while now. So I was finally like, you know what? Okay, I'll get them all to shut up and I'll just put it up on Substack.
Yeah, the reason why I don't remember if it was before or after, but I was I had some journals that I had written, several decades ago, or on
Mhm.
1 or 2 decades ago, and I'd written these journals, and they were handwritten. And that at the time, I was feeling like I was, too much online. I was too much on the internet. I still feel like that, but I said I'm not going to type this up. And part of it may have been because I had actually been working like with a flash drive, and I lost the flash drive, and I lost an incredible amount of,
Mhm.
and that has been devastating for me. Is there have been a couple times in my life, like I had a few years ago, I had 30,000 words that I had written that were
Mhm.
destroyed. That I can't recover those. And there's a ways around that. You back things up, you put it on the cloud, etc. Um, but it's funny because you'd think a physical object would be more likely to be impermanent than like the internet. They say the internet's forever. The Wayback Machine, it's all up there. But
Right.
actually, these journals, I've carried them around with me. I never really reviewed them. I didn't go back and read them. I didn't deal with them. So I opened it up and I started to transcribe them. And as I was trying to convert this written word into typed word, I realized that I was losing something. Like
Mhm.
there were little ways that, and this is actually something I think, in criminology, there's a study of handwriting. I forget what the term is, but they're supposed to be able to, for instance, a serial killer writes a note, and
Mhm.
you're trying to figure out who the suspect is. And so they bring in these certain, psychologists who study handwriting. They say, well, this is probably a man's writing. And also, we're going to determine that, this is the type of personality. Now, maybe that's all astrology. Maybe that's like, I don't know how, accurate, like as a scientific discipline, that is. But intuitively, that's appealing to me because we all do know, girls write different from boys. And that's not because the teachers tell the girls to write different from the boys, but because the females are just, they're representing a part of themselves in the way that they write. They're representing their femininity in the way that they write, and the
Mhm.
boys are representing their masculinity. And in some ways, that tells us something about men and women when you look at female handwriting, male handwriting. And then if you see a male that has, more feminine writing, or a female that has more male writing, that you also know something about them as an individual, or my personal belief is it's probably more accurate than astrology. Um, but
Yeah.
at
Yeah.
the very least, yeah, I realize there's like very subtle little emotional cues in terms of the size of a particular word, in
Mhm.
relation to other words. the spacing of, how tall is each letter, how wide is each letter, how jam packed. Like, obviously, if you put a little parentheses and then you scribble a bunch of things really tight together, you get that feeling of narrowness, of this is something that I want I want to say, but I'm I'm kind of I may be indecisive, or I'm hesitant, and so I'm going to condense
Mhm.
it to downplay it. Whereas when you type that out, you lose all of that spacing. And you lose things that are emphasized and de-emphasized. You still have the ability to use things
Yeah.
like bold, italics, capital letters. It's not quite
Mhm.
the same. Um, so yeah, it gives you a lot more options. And yeah, I wonder. I know that there are. I've seen digital artists use like an iPad, and they draw on the iPad
Mhm.
to do digital art. Um, have you ever experimented with something like a digital iPad or something like that? And um, I'm not saying you should replace what you're doing with something like that. I'm just thinking for to make that more accessible to people. Um,
Mhm.
or to kind of promote that. I wonder if maybe that's an in between of starting to
Yeah.
write in that way.
Yeah, I can see that. I've never really experienced with it. I have an iPad for my job that I don't use personally at all. Um, but the I'm despite my reasonably nice handwriting, um, I'm not. I don't have any talent as a visual artist. So I've never like bought one of the Apple pencils or played around with that kind of thing at all. I do think that that would be a kind of in between medium in a lot of ways. Uh, the You certainly would get a lot more of that expression. And one thing I wanted to note about the expressiveness, right, is that you know if you tweak your fonts and font sizes and so on and so forth while you're typing something, you could probably produce the same effect. But A, it would be a total pain in the ass to do, right? And B, it would mean that all of it would have to be conscious, because that's kind of the thing, is that when we handwrite, those different like letter sizes and all of these different pieces are mostly unconscious choices that we're making, right? Still choices, but like we're not paying attention to it and thinking about it. We don't have to, click on a button or change a size or anything like that to produce the effect. It's just flowing naturally from the hand. And that's a huge change. That's a huge difference between doing that and then trying to mimic it on a computer in some way. Uh, the there was one other thing on that I was going to mention, which was that actually similar kind of thing in an opposite ways going on for me in terms of handwriting the poetry instead of typing it, is that if I just sit down and type out a poem, right? I type much faster than I can handwrite. And so it produces something that will be a lot more kind of stream of consciousness. Um, more, it's tapping more into kind of that unconscious aspect, as opposed to handwriting where, you know, when I make this mark on this page is now permanently marked. So I need to be really certain about the decisions that I'm making. Which isn't to say I don't have a bunch of messy drafts of stuff where I am scribbling because I've got ideas and I'm trying to sort stuff out, but it really changes the way that you relate to what it is that you're creating. Um, and a keyboard, whether it's on my iPhone or on my computer, like that mode of interacting with what I'm writing is, um, for me, and I'm saying only as far as I'm sure for other people too, but for me, it's inimical to producing something like poetry.
Yeah, the other thing that I noticed is So there's messiness and order. When
Mhm.
you write more quickly, it's more chaotic. You write slowly, so you can actually reconstruct in the same way that you're doing it unconsciously. People are unconsciously reading that and seeing how um, you wrote something hastily or you wrote something very carefully, and the
Mhm.
reader can implicitly speed up or slow down their reading to match that.
Mhm.
Whereas you can't do that as well with typing. One of the ways I try to do that, or one of the devices you can use, is with punctuation. You can use ellipses
Yes.
and periods and dashes and all sorts of colons in order to try to speed things up and slow things down. The other thing I noticed was that your words, because you're writing line by line, your words fit together like puzzle pieces. And this is where I think you are a visual artist. Even, you could say, oh, I'm not as impressive as a painter or something. But there is an aspect of it is an art and it is visual. Um,
Mhm.
you are making these decisions. Like you have a poem from April 13th, 2013, where there's down, the seventh line. There's this word thing, and everything is written here. What's the opposite of standard script? Not cursive, but the word
Print. Yeah.
thing, the word thing becomes cursive, and
Mhm.
and as it becomes cursive, the T in the thing connects with the G in the word above it, which is taught. Um, how again are you? uh, uh, you're saying that some of this is unconscious, and so you're not necessarily planning how each letter interacts with each other letter. But then you go down to the bottom, um, and there's these two lines: "I will rage until my raging's done, and I cry out, oh Abba, Abba, Abba." So you look at
Mhm.
um, until my raging, and then you look at oh Abba, Abba, and that those two lines above and below each other, they fit together like puzzle pieces. Whereas you choose line 7 and 6, you choose to connect taught and thing through the G and the T, almost like forming one continuous letter. In the last two
Mhm.
lines, you intersperse, the Y in my goes down between the O and Abba. The G of the raging goes between the B and the exclamation mark. And that actually happens twice, where it's almost like teeth coming together. These
Mhm.
two spikes going up and down, interconnecting like puzzle pieces, as opposed to taught and thing being like integrated together into one continuous flowing word. So where you get in that interconnection, it creates this sense of integration or seduction or intimacy. In the last two lines, it just accentuates the almost chaos or violence or aggression, predation. Um,
Mhm.
so yeah, those sorts of choices, even like you were saying, oh well, technically, digitally, what you could do is you could change the font of every word, you could change the size of every word, but um, you can't integrate lines together, which is really important for poetry. That each line
Mhm.
is a unit in the same way that a letter is a unit, a word is a unit, a sentence is a unit. In poetry, each line is a unit. And your ability to create parallels and relationships between lines, that's not something that's allowed um, with fonts, because it has a uniform, this distance between the lines. Like
Right.
you can go into a word processor and you can change the distance between the lines, but you're never going to get the G or the Y to intersect and interconnect with each other like that, which you can do with writing. And so, like at some point, there really is no workaround but to do it by hand, whether that's as you're doing physically. There's also, again, iPads allow for a digital option, which are kind of expensive to be. It's probably just cheaper just to write it out and
Yeah.
take a picture. And also, there's a responsive feel that you get. You're using ink, and
Mhm.
when I don't know. Some of these Zoomers have never. I don't know what they're doing in school these days, if they still even use ink pens. But back in the day, we had these ink pens, and sometimes there was like a randomness of the pen where it would leak out a little bit more ink than you expected, or it would run out of ink unexpectedly. Um,
Yeah.
and sometimes you have to go. And now I've looked through some of these, and I haven't seen your pen go out on you very much, but you can see instances maybe where things are a bit bolder because maybe you dwell a little bit longer. I said like
Mhm.
spacing is a determination of speed, but also the thickness of the ink gives us an insight to the speed at which you're writing. So yeah, we've talked a lot about some of the technical aspects. I think it's pretty cool, and I'm basically just arguing that I want to see more of this on Substack. Like, if you're a poet, you need to follow this example, and you need to try to do this, because it adds a new dimension. But get maybe without hammering the technical details too much. I also want to
Mhm.
talk a bit broader about. You said you just started doing this technique. You haven't seen other people doing it. In terms of poetry at the broadest level, what are your inspirations? I'm a fan of Poe. Um,
Mhm.
Probably, I mean, everybody we're all fans of Shakespeare, whether we want to be or not, because he's influenced so much of our language, consciously or
Yeah.
unconsciously. Who are your big influences in poetry?
Yeah. I'm I'm pleased you're a fan of Poe. I think he's of the American romantics, he's just far and away the best. He's such a master. Um, yeah, I like Poe a lot. um, I'd say as far as my major influences and inspirations, I'm really picky about poetry. Um, a lot more so than most English majors like myself are. But the I'm a big fan of T.S. Eliot, at least some of his poetry, particularly The Wasteland, Love Song of J. Alfred Prufrock, Journey of the Magi. Um, the I also really fell in love with Gerard Manley Hopkins a while ago, who's really just a stunning poet in terms of the way that he uses language and the way that it sounds when you read or recite it, is really remarkable. I'm not. Um, he has some technical stuff, just like Eliot does with Eliot's, objective correlative and the way that he uses counterpoint in the way that he composes his poetry. Um, Hopkins has this whole thing about inscape and outscape, and it's always kind of confused me. I don't understand it super well, but I know that I love his poetry and how it sounds. And I've memorized a number of his poems. Um, so, in terms of older poetry, them, and then I also really like John Donne and George Herbert. Um, in terms of more modern poets, maybe more similar to my style and more free verse, like mine is. Um, I am a really big fan of. Actually, I'm not 100% sure on the pronunciation of his last name. I've always heard it Robert Hass, but it might be supposed to be pronounced Haas. I'm not totally sure. Uh, he's still alive, although I think he's in his like late 80s at this point. Um, and he's a really remarkable poet. Pretty free verse, doesn't rhyme very much, but has an incredible ear for meter and cadence, and just knows how to just gut you with what he talks about. The first of his poems I remember ever memorized is called "Faint Music," and it's a poem. It's a poem about grace in the face of despair, and it's absolutely stunning. So I really like Haas, or Haas, however you pronounce his name. And there's another living poet I'm a big fan of, although I haven't memorized any of his poetry as yet, which is B.H. Fairchild, who's he's in California and has been for a long time, but he's really kind of a quintessential Midwestern American poet. He has a poem called Beauty that is just jaw dropping in how well it's executed and how it captures the notion of beauty through particular experience. So so yeah, I have I have a lot of other poets who I like a lot of different pieces by, and I probably have, I think, 35 or 40 poems memorized overall, um, and in a variety of different styles and the like. But yeah, in terms of influence, I would say Hass and Hopkins have influenced me a lot, and so has Eliot. And then in a more indirect way, John Donne has influenced me a lot as well.
That would be Donne, sort of
Yes.
16th century. Yeah. So
Yeah.
you know, I'm not an English major, so I'm not as familiar with all these guys as you.
Mhm.
I've heard of Eliot. I've read Poe. I think that um, I believe Eliot was he just a poet, or did he also do prose writing as well?
Yeah, no, he did. He wrote some plays, and he also wrote literary criticism. He's primarily remembered as a poet, but
Right.
yeah.
Right. Yeah. I so my first attempt to memorize poetry was with Lewis Carroll and J.R.R. Tolkien,
Uh,
um,
uh,
and I think that um, so I wasn't like when I became an independent reader, I wasn't seeking out poetry directly, but I was seeking
mhm,
out stories. And when those poems occurred in those stories, they attracted me. Um,
mhm.
and I think one of the reasons why I like so the poem by Lewis Carroll is the Jabberwocky, and
Oh yeah.
Tolkien, I believe it's I'm not sure actually what the title is anymore, but down by the door where we began. And
Oh yeah.
both of those poems, or it's called "The Road Goes Ever On." So those poems, which actually that was before I had seen the movie where they feature that poem. I already liked it. Um,
Mhm,
they are both very much focused on Lewis, the Jabberwocky is focused on creating language in a way that is organic and appeals to intuitive, like onomatopoetic, or
mhm.
like the how do I say this? The auditory logic of the English language, where
Yeah.
you're creating a word that has no dictionary definition, but intuitively people can already understand what it means because you're tapping into the auditory texture of the language.
Mhm.
And with Tolkien, he's not using invented language, although he did invent languages, and he did write. I
And
believe,
wrote poems in them.
yeah, he
Yeah.
wrote poems in his invented languages, which is pretty far out. Um, but specifically with that, the road goes ever on. I think the reason why it's appealing to me is because he was a professor of Anglo-Saxon. And so he
Mhm,
understood that English is not a single language, English is a patchwork of languages, and that
mhm,
you can weave that I mean, it's not to say that you can't or shouldn't use all of those languages that are available within English, but he was trying to get at an older and maybe more organic. And basically, he wanted to speak, or he wanted to demonstrate a folk English, that there was a particular, because for example, I think in America now, I mean there's assumption, white people are majority in America, and so there's a phrase that's like white people don't have any culture, and
mhm.
there are aspects in which I think that's kind of true, and there's aspects where that's kind of false, and I think that maybe that wasn't that phrase or that idea hasn't become or that wasn't present in the time when Tolkien was writing. But I think there
Mhm.
was this sense that as Britain became an empire, as it became multicultural, multi-religious, multiracial, I think there was this feeling that Britain and Britishness had already become somewhat of a universal or scientific or objective or standard thing. Like to be British was
Mhm.
to be civilized, and the sort of indigenous Britishness was lost. It
Mhm.
wasn't just that as Britain went around the world and colonized other people, it destroyed those local cultures and imposed British values. But it was that as Britain expanded into the world, it also lost some of its indigenousness. And again, that's another thing that people will say is that, Europeans are not indigenous people, or that, the only indigenous Europeans are like the Sami people because they don't speak an Indo-European
Right.
language. And I think that, like, on a deep historical level, these aren't purely modern phenomenon. This isn't purely like a 19th century phenomenon, because it is true that we for a lot, like mythologically, um, we do, like, the Greeks did preserve the idea of the Dorian invasion. There
Mhm.
is this concept of European culture as a migratory culture, as a Faustian culture that's not really
Mhm.
confined to any particular area of the globe, but it's there's this inherently like globalist quality to it. That
Mhm.
maybe other cultures have aspects of that as well, but I think it's not just. I mean, I would almost say that this spirit created modernity, not that modernity created this alienation. We're kind of
Right.
reversing the causality on that. So, what I think is interesting about Tolkien and the movement, like romantic Viking revivalism, like the
Mhm.
movement he was a part of, trying to go back and figure out paganism, trying to translate that into the modern day. Um, you're it's almost like, in the same way that we could be fascinated by meeting an obscure tribe in the Amazon rainforest who have a totally different conception of, gods and magic and language, and we would be curious about that, we'd be fascinated about that. What Tolkien almost does is he takes us on a journey to meet the indigenous British people, and or indigenous European people more broadly in the Germanic tradition. Um, and so it's almost like you're meeting this new Aboriginal folk people for the first time, but at the same time, they're very familiar and they're very comfortable
Mhm.
because they are the founders of the language that we speak. So it's
Yeah.
almost like, I would compare it to, like, let's say, you grow up and you're an orphan or something, you don't really know your parents, and then, someone gives you this book of photographs, and it shows your ancestors, and you can look back and see what your grandparents looked like, and you start to see the resemblance between yourself and your ancestors. And it awakens this kind of curiosity, and you start to read about, what they were like, and you see those parallels, even though maybe they had a different religion or a different culture. You still see
Mhm.
the echoes of that in yourself, and so it's a form of self exploration. And so that's why I kind of appreciate Tolkien's emphasis on Anglo-Saxon and the language, and trying to reconstruct that or translate that, give that to people in a way they can understand, because he was just reading primary texts, and he
Mhm.
could read Anglo-Saxon. I can't read Anglo-Saxon, most people can't, but he wanted to kind of create this intermediary way where you could use modern English but with an Anglo-Saxon accent, and
Mhm.
point backward toward that. So I think and I think actually Lewis Carroll does the same thing in the Jabberwocky, where you look at all of those invented words, and they are very Anglo-Saxon in their orientation.
Oh yeah.
Um, so yeah, that's I wanted to ask you. You're an English major. Did you ever have some second language exposure, and how do you perceive, and how do you think of do you think of English as being a monolithic language, or do you in your own way, do you consider it to have sub languages or different almost nations within it?
Yeah, no. So I took a lot of Latin and less Greek. I took a smattering of uh, French and Spanish and German in middle and high school. Um, I never became actually fluent in another language, which I kind of regret a little bit, I guess. It would be nice to have done all of that work and actually have developed the fluency, but also I never super enjoyed doing the work. So I'm kind of okay with not having gone all the way through it. I really value having taken as much Latin as I did, especially because nothing teaches you English grammar like learning Latin. Um, but as far as kind of the nature of the English language in that sense, yeah, it's and I mean, plenty of people have talked about this, but English is definitely not monolithic in that kind of way. Like we've got that Germanic side to it. We have the very strong Latinate aspect, right? The Romance effect on it. And it's all very mixed together. And it's really cool because it opens the language up. I think Borge talks about this in an essay somebody was telling me about last week. Um, but a particular, there are different. You can choose like the Latin version of an English word for something, and it will give a particular kind of sense of what it is that you mean. And then you can choose the Anglo-Saxon version of that or one of several different, and it gives a much more kind of guttural, less intellectual, more kind of emotional tone to what it is that you're saying. And we use all of these words jumbled together um, in our day-to-day speech, and it just gives us this whole extra range of expression that a lot of other languages just do not have. Where um, I wish I could remember the exact example that Borges uses because, of course, it's perfect. But I can choose to describe I can choose to describe the light in a variety of different ways, and depending on which, they can all be perfectly accurate and just mean that it's twilight, right? But depending on how I decide to express it, it's going to bring across a very different sense of that same description, right? It gives an extra emotional weight. And because English is such a hodgepodge of different languages, and has had so much influence from so many different ones, it has just that much wider range of expression.
Yeah, I also studied Latin. Did you have the opportunity to read any Latin poetry when you were studying?
So when I finished doing. We did the Aeneid. I think we did the first three books of the Aeneid in my last Latin class, which I tried to read the Aeneid in English a number of times before and just been bored out of my skull. And then reading it in Latin, I was blown away. It's a magnificent poem. But a lot of it just gets lost in translation because so much of the brilliance of it has to do with the actual form of um, of how the poetry works in Latin in a way that just cannot possibly be brought over into certainly not into English, probably not into many other languages at all. Um, so yeah, the Aeneid was a trip.
Yeah, I know that medieval authors, I think, had a technique where they would use the Aeneid as a form of divination, where you'd want the answer to a question, and so you would turn to a random part of the Aeneid and stick your finger on it, and then read the line and try to interpret that as the answer to your question. So it was very
Right.
popular, and I think that yeah, it is the Roman answer to the Iliad. Um,
Mhm.
I never got a handle on Greek, so I haven't been able to to penetrate the Iliad. I'm I guess in terms of the mythological structure, I find the Odyssey more appealing, because
Hmm.
it's rather than about the fall of a city, it's about the founding of a new city, and it's not about going to a settlement and destroying it. It's about leaving destruction behind, and going into the
Oh,
unknown.
the Aeneid, you mean, rather than the Odyssey?
Well, the Iliad is about the
The
destruction
Iliad's
of
about destruction of Troy.
right.
The Aeneid's about the founding of Rome.
Oh no, I was comparing the well, we're talking about three works: the Iliad, the Odyssey, and the
Yeah, yeah.
Aeneid. Yeah. So well, the Aeneid actually is basically it's kind of a parallel story to the Odyssey in a certain
Hmm.
way. Um,
Yeah.
it and it, actually, I would even say this, that like mythologically speaking, the Iliad, as like, well, if we consider this to be a trinity, the
Hmm.
Iliad is about um, the destruction of civilization, the fall of civilization. It's I interpret it as a tragedy. Um,
Hmm.
and then the Odyssey is about uh, the ability to, like a phoenix, you rise from the ashes, and eventually you
Yeah.
come home. But the Aeneid even takes it further, and instead of going from being lost and wandering to returning home, it's actually about creating an entirely new home, one that has never
Yeah.
existed before. So in a sense, the Aeneid is like an a radicalization of the Odyssey. And yeah, I found a translation. I didn't finish it at the time because it was like borrowed from the library, but I read a translation of the Aeneid that I thought was pretty good. I thought was fairly compelling, and it made me. It was one of those things where I was in a secular atheist period of life, and reading that about the gods, and I wasn't convinced that the gods were like real, and I started to praying to the gods or something. But I was like, I don't
Right.
know, this religion thing is fairly powerful, and maybe I should give it a second look. Um, and yeah, so it's interesting, for me, that a lot of my experience with poetry has been through a more narrative approach. Even
Hmm.
Poe, um,
Hmm.
he actually, the vast majority of his written work was um, political commentary, news reports, short stories, longer stories. I mean, in terms of word count, his poetry is actually a small fraction of what he wrote in his
Yeah.
life, because he had to make money. He was, and he had a similar career to Charles Dickens, who
Hmm.
wrote, just an incredible millions and millions and millions of words, and they were all serialized in these publications. So, this was a period in the 19th century where you could call it, you could say there was a bourgeois aspect, where you weren't just right. It wasn't like Lord Byron, who's just an aristocrat and he has all the money he'll ever need, and he has the leisure to travel around and have all these mistresses, and maybe in his spare time he can write a poem or two. Or Oscar Wilde, is like, he has this aristocratic mindset, and he's not necessarily writing um, to earn a living, for practical purposes, to feed himself, but
Hey.
he's just writing for the love of the art. And I think that there is
Mhm.
a tendency to view that as like the superior. And I think that's a fair argument to say, like, producing art for art's sake is probably better than producing it for commercial reasons. Although I don't know that they're always mutually exclusive. And I think sometimes the fact that,
Right.
for Poe, he did live a difficult life. I mean, he did struggle with poverty. He did struggle with, his wife died, who was also his cousin, and that is a controversial
Yeah.
uh, aspect of his life. But because he did deal with a lot of tragedy, I mean, that was what motivated um, his poetry rather than just kind of having this ennui or this sort of like leisure and oh, I could write a poem if I wanted to. For Poe, it was like this burning desire of like I have to write this. He also wrote theoretically, which surprised me because when I was first exposed to him, um, a lot of, and maybe this is how you write poetry, but I think I had a default assumption that, just like it says in the Aeneid that Virgil says, oh, muses, tell me what to write. And so there's this
Mhm.
sense that poetry is about divine inspiration, and you wake up from a dream and you have to write it. And I've had experiences like that as well. But it's interesting that Poe actually wrote methodically about and almost scientifically about the structure of a poem, and saying, first I start with the broadest concept of what emotion do I want to inspire. And he says that the most beautiful emotion is sadness, because sadness is the least um, sensual, it's the most ethereal, it's the most sensitive. Whereas things like anger, it's more animalistic, or happiness, it's more sensual. Whereas sadness is almost, it inherently creates a pathos of distance. It inherently it creates, it's inherently rooted in a sense of longing, and that's where
Mhm.
the most intense form of contemplation, I think he says, on the level of the soul. I mean, kind of, it's a Platonic idea of like, you have the realm of your senses that can be satisfied, and then you have like thumos and your passions. But then, like, on the level of the
Mhm.
soul, he thought that sadness was the closest emotion. So that's oftentimes what he was trying to inspire. And then from that very basic or broad emotional template, he would then dial into, more specific things of, here's the structure that I want for the stanzas, and he goes into detail there. But I thought that was interesting because, when I started, the first poetry I wrote was kind of modeled off Poe and trying to like copy him
Mhm.
or plagiarize or invert him. Like I wanted to write The Raven, but I wanted to make it happy instead of sad. And so I didn't
Mhm.
methodically plan it out. I just kind of, went line by line and kind of ad libbed it. But yeah, it's interesting. Do you, you said that with some of these, you're doing more drafting, and then maybe other poems you do it more spontaneously. Um, how much do you feel like you talked a lot, you actually used some words I'm not familiar. I think you said like abject space and inject space and those sorts of terms.
Oh, yeah.
Like, how much do you think poetic theory um, helps and supports you? Is uh,
Mhm.
do you feel like there's a perfect balance between spontaneity and theory? Some people say it's like you should be totally spontaneous. Where do you feel like you're in that balance?
Yeah, so great question. Um, so I'm going to preface all of this with my experience is that you shouldn't ever trust other writers to tell you how to write because mostly they're just trying to universalize particulars. Writers are um, writers are of course very superstitious by nature, and I'm not going to exclude myself from that at all. And the thing is that, like, you know, if you're trying to learn how to write, whether it's poetry or prose or otherwise, like there are definitely some basics that you can learn that it's valuable to kind of sort out. But when you're looking for the particulars, well, how much should I write, or what counts as practicing my writing, and so on and so forth. If you start paying attention to what particular, especially really talented writers and poets have to say, you're just going to get lost because the reality of it, in my experience, and of course, this is me giving writing advice, right? So this applies to me as well. But the thing is that exactly how it works just varies a lot by individual. It's like diet, you know, where everybody has a prescription for like this is the right way to eat that will make sure that you remain healthy. And it's just there's no universal that works for everyone. Um, for my part, like to explain what I do and kind of how I operate with that, the in general, most of my poems begin with a particular line or phrase or a very, very clear mental image that I want to explore and kind of expand on. And then basically from there, I sit down and I start writing it out. And sometimes, more rarely than not, it will come out where it really comes out really good. And I need to maybe redraft it once or twice, make a couple of tweaks, and then I really feel like it has become the thing that it was trying to be, and I can let it go. Um, Much more often, it becomes this laborious thing where by between draft one and draft 20, like there's like one word that's the same, and everything else has changed. I know it's still the same poem. I'm still focused on the same image or the same particular emotional aspect, but like it's unrecognizable. It really, it really differs case by case. Um, I do find that because you're talking a little bit about you know the art for art's sake as opposed to you know for commercial profit kind of aspect. And I agree with you regarding Poe that you know maybe you can really marry those two. In fact, a lot of writers, I think you can really those two don't have to be in conflict with each other. Um, I know that for me, writing poetry, um, if I if my livelihood depended on this in any real significant way, and I don't even have paid subscriptions turned on, um, it would make it very difficult for me to relate to what I'm writing because the way that I think about what I write really is it is sort of muse oriented, like how you were starting there, where I'm putting in the time to sit down and like have my pen and my notebook ready and be working on writing, and the muse shows up sometimes, and like I can actually produce something which I look back at and I'm like, wow, that's actually really good. I wish I was reading this just as a reader, which you know is kind of my goal with all of my poetry. Is I want to write something which, if I came across it, I would like it. I'd be moved. Um, I might even be tempted to memorize it. And so, if I if I mix like my livelihood in with that, I don't trust my ability to still interact with my work as itself, as an independent kind of creature, which really is what it comes down to, is that I write a poem, what I'm trying to do when I edit it, when I redraft it, as I work on it with the muse when she shows up, is I'm trying to help that thing that I'm creating, that I'm sub creating in Tolkien's terms. I'm trying to help it become itself and then send it off into the world and let it then live its own existence. And someone may read it and may have a totally different understanding of it than I do. That's completely reasonable. That's how language works. That's especially how artistic creation works. um, which isn't to say that I'm not present in it. Uh, I am still, there's still something of me in that creation, but it is a separate thing from me. And my goal is to prepare it, make it as good as it can. It's like raising a child, which I've never done, but prepare it for the world and then send it out into the world to continue to develop and change and interact with people in whatever way it's going to. So, so yeah, it's as far as method and mode. I write everything by hand. I redraft by hand, um, and that works for me because it fits with the way that I think and the way that I helps me be more deliberate and careful and do fewer drafts because I'm actually editing as I'm writing out each new draft. I'm thinking so much more carefully about, well, is this the right word or is this just the convenient word? And if I were typing, I'd just, type the convenient word so I can finish the thing and then run through it and edit it again. So, yeah, rambling answer to your question.
No, it's good. It makes me think about the way, all the things that you described. It's interesting because, like, when I first read a Poe's essay on how to write poetry, I don't think that's the title, but, I was kind of blown away. I was like, whoa, this isn't just a spontaneous process like I do, kind of a discursive line by line, word by word, just as it comes to you, and then redrafting to get it perfect. It was like, he had this whole plan set out. And I think every poet has a plan in some sense, even if it's just an image, as
Mhm.
you say. Like there is an ideal that's being worked toward at some level. And
Mhm.
that thing you said, I really liked what you said about you might start with a poem, and then the final draft, there's only one word that's the same, but it's still the same poem. And I was just like, yeah, I've had those experiences where you write a poem and you draft, and yet you look at it, it's like, whoa, this doesn't look anything like what I started with, but it is the same. It's all part of the same process. I couldn't have gotten to the final draft. Like I had to go through these intermediary steps. It was a necessary,
Mhm.
it's kind of like the poem is an iceberg and the reader gets to see the tip of that iceberg, but the true poem is like, it's the process, it's everything underneath. And that's kind of like the private pleasure of the poet, is to go through
Yeah.
that process. And that's something you can really only access through, you know, reading poetry allows you. It maybe it opens up within you that process, but it can
Mhm.
never. You can lead the horse to water, but you can't make him drink. You can teach a man, or you can give a man a fish, but you won't necessarily know how to fish. So I encourage people to, see the value in the same way that it's better to play sports than to watch sports. Participate in poetry, and where people feel like they don't have the ability, um, there is value to reading poetry. There's value to learning languages. There's value to just starting wherever you start. But I guess I feel that sometimes when we look at a poem, like if it's published online and we just see the text, there's almost there's so much distance and almost like a dehumanization where we
Mhm.
maybe rightly so, but we place poets on a pedestal and we say that I could never be like that, and therefore, that person is a poet in their essence, and I am not.
Yeah.
And there's this gap that cannot be bridged. But I find that you humanize the act of writing poetry when you
Mhm.
publish the physical writing, the photograph of the physical page. That excited me because it reminded me, it made me remember that poets are humans too, and we can all write poetry, and it's not just a product that comes from you know heaven or from the gods or something like that. um in some senses it does, but in another
Yeah.
sense there is like an earthly, humanistic. I mean, we are embodied creatures. We have, we have physical in our hands. Is what makes us human. It's not our brains. If we just had
Yeah.
brains and no opposable thumbs, no hands, we wouldn't have tools. We wouldn't have civilization. I don't care how smart you are. If you don't have the ability to manipulate the world around you, none of this exists. And so, in some sense,
Yeah.
you're paying credence to the hand that
Mhm.
literally fashioned humanity and civilization. And I think that's really, to me, in the same way that I'm impacted by painting, because you can
Mhm.
see the strokes of the paint. I'm
Yeah.
impacted by sculpture because you can see the marks of the chisel. And so
Mhm.
it's a kind of a signature, or it's a indication of there was a physical human that made this physical thing, and there's a connection between our embodied state and our mind, and it's the unity between the mind and the body that is the
Yeah.
source of beauty in art. And if we lose the body, I'm trying to remember the name of the German or Swiss mystic, who, it'll come to me later, but he had this idea of, oftentimes in Christianity there's a dualism between Christ and the devil, but he said it's actually it's there's Ahriman and Lucifer and Christ in the middle, and Christ is the balance between the Ahrimanic, which is totally material, and the Luciferian, which is totally spiritual. But Christ has both
Mhm.
natures, both the spiritual and the material nature, united into one. And so I think that represents the necessity for the unity between those things. And so what you're doing to me just called that to mind and was inspiring. So I appreciate. We don't have a lot of time left. We're coming to the end of our
Yeah.
hour here. I think you've, more than sufficiently. I'm not trying to extract any more out of you, but I do want to give you the opportunity, if you felt like there was something we left out, to have the last word and closing thoughts.
Yeah. No. Sure. The I guess the last thing that I want to add kind of builds off that same point that you're talking about, which is that the other thing about writing by hand is that it's costly in the same way, although not to nearly the same degree as sculpting with a chisel is. It takes a lot of time. And as human beings, we value what we pay for much more than what comes free. And if I just slap poems out on my keyboard, even if I were producing the same words, right, the ease with which that happens devalues what I'm creating in my own eyes. And it's a work of love to spend the time to do something that is costly, even if it's not difficult. It's like writing a letter by hand to someone instead of typing it up. You may say the exact same words. That letter that you write by hand is going to mean infinitely more than one that you type up and then print off and mail to them. That being said, a printed and mailed letter will also mean a lot to people, because everyone likes getting mail, but nobody gets any anymore. So, yeah, that's kind of the last relevant point I wanted to bring up. But hey, really appreciate you taking the time to do this, and been looking forward to it since we first started talking about it. I'm really glad we made it happen.
Absolutely, yeah. I wish I could be even speedier, but we got it eventually. And yeah, I don't get to speak to too many poets, and I think it's an area where, I don't know if it's technically part of the seven liberal arts. It might be put under literature, but yeah, I think that we got to bring it back. We got to restore that art, as we've got to restore all the other arts, as
Mhm.
as cultural renaissance, if that's what we're going for. So anyway, I appreciate your time as well, and I hope that in the future we can collaborate in one way or another. Maybe at some point I'll put out another poem, and we can not have it just be a conversation between an artist and an analyst, but between two active artists, because it's a practice.
Yeah.
You are what you do, and so when you write poetry, you become a
Yep.
poet. So yeah, that's all the time we have for today. I appreciate it and hope to speak with you again soon.
Take care, Deep Left.
All right, take care. Bye bye. All right, guys, like, comment, and restack. It's all the time I have for today. I will see you next time. Bye bye.